over to Kirtana, who is going to talk a little bit about her work at Friends of the Earth International on food sovereignty and the impacts that the coronavirus pandemic is having on our global food system, and some of the ways that that exposes the issues that were already there, but also how, if we're thinking about a just recovery and we're thinking about trying to get out of this, what things should we be seeing at an international level that would be helpful. So I'm going to pass over to Kirtana now.
To unmute. Great. So yeah, can everybody hear me fine? I hope so. Okay, cool. So yeah, it's really, really great to be here, and it's fantastic to have such a big turnout. So I'm just going to get right to it. And I think the first thing I wanted to say is that obviously we are all here in a way on this call because of the COVID-19 crisis and because of the huge toll that it's taken already on people's lives, but which is actually expanding and deepening, but also highlighting existing inequalities, including on class and wealth, nutrition and health, and also race and gender, which will have a direct impact on who will live and who will die in this crisis. But as kind of environmental justice campaigners, we've always known that these issues have a direct impact on who will live and who will die in our world generally, and also as we face the converging social and ecological crises that we find ourselves in, of poverty, of hunger, climate change, ecosystem destruction. And as people concerned with environmental and social justice who hope to build something different, I think it's really important for all of us to connect the dots of what we are fighting against and what we're fighting for together. And it's what we call in FOI as system change. And so we are fighting against injustices of gender, of race, of environmental injustice and social injustice. And one of the things that it's important, I think, for all of us to realize is the power of what we're fighting against is the power of global capital, which you will hear about, and maybe it sounds abstract, but it actually manifests in very concrete ways in our lives with the kind of extraordinary power that given to transnational corporations who control every facet of our lives now, what we eat, where we live, how we socialize. It's also the endless search for growth and accumulation and profit that our economic system is wired into our economic system. And the obsession with neoliberalism, which is kind of prioritizes and worships markets over everything else, over life, over health, as we've seen now, and over food sovereignty. So these are the systems that have created the kind of deep inequalities between and within countries, and violence as well. And this is the story of COVID-19. And the industrial food system is a great exemplifier of all these things. And so the story that we tell about what's happened with COVID-19 really matters for people who understand it. So that's kind of also what I want to talk about. And also how the industrial food system has set the stage, not just for the suffering that COVID-19 is causing, but also about how it's come about in the first place. So I'm going to try to do three things all in 15 minutes. A quick whirlwind tour of the industrial food system in crisis, and then on the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis, and finally on what some of our solutions look like. So let's give it a go. So the first thing that is very important to say is that the industrial food system was in crisis well before the COVID pandemic hit. So we already had over 800 million people hungry, 2 billion overweight, another 2 billion malnourished, children and people across the world, even in the UK, 1 million people using food banks, children 1 school meal away from hunger, and several countries, many countries, especially in the developing world, at the mercy of international markets to feed their populations, and of course the huge destruction of ecosystems from industrial agriculture. And all this is in the context where we have for many, many years been producing more than enough food to feed 9 billion people, not just the 6+ that we have today. But the approach to food by Western governments, the majority of the international institutions, like the World Trade Organization, has been to treat food as a commodity rather than a human right. And the whole system is geared to maximize profit for agribusiness. So that's where we started with. And now I'm going to say three things about the links between industrial agriculture and the COVID-19 crisis. The first thing is that large-scale commodity agriculture or industrial agriculture, so things that like massive production of things like soya, corn, sugarcane, palm oil, for animal feed, for biofuels, or for heavily processed foods, biscuits and things you see in the supermarket, is the leading cause of ecosystem destruction. And the link is there because a lot of experts have now discussed how pandemics are kind of caused and catalyzed by activities that bring increasing numbers of people into direct contact with wild animals that carry these pathogens. And so we've created this kind of perfect storm with all this destruction from the system, including other things like mining and infrastructure, but industrial farming is very important. The second thing is that destruction of ecosystems has kind of wiped out what experts call natural fire breaks, which is basically genetic diversity in ecosystems that dissipates viruses before they can reach us. And the third thing, just on this issue, is that you could not design a better system to spread diseases than animal factory farming, which has millions of animals in crowded spaces with very narrow genetic diversity. So, I mean, even before COVID-19, we had several of these pandemics. For example, African swine flu, which killed half the pig population in China. The second way that it's linked is that the industrial food system is a massive creator of hunger and poverty that dictates who will be most affected by COVID-19, especially in developing countries. So 50% of farmers and farm workers live below the poverty line in developing countries. 70% of those most hungry in the world are small-scale food producers, but also rural to urban migration, which is one of the biggest migrations that's happened in the last few years, have created urban slums, which are going to be massively hit by this crisis. But even in countries where many of you probably come from, in Australia, Europe, and the US, food industry workers are paid poverty wages, working in slavery conditions. There's 1 million undocumented migrant workers in the US working on farms, several 100,000 in the EU, mostly from North Africa and Eastern Europe, who work in slavery conditions even before the virus, and who are now being called kind of essential workers and still expected to work in these absolutely awful conditions. And this is kind of exemplified by this kind of crisis that happened this week in Tyson Foods, if anybody was following that, in the US, where they are forcing their workers to go back to work in factory farms, although they have had a massive outbreak of COVID-19 in those factory farms. The important thing to know about all this is that many people will talk about it, but it's not an accident, as no poverty is an accident in our world. It's because corporations control every aspect of this system, inputs and seeds and fertilizers, grain trading, financial markets, and especially relevant in the UK, but probably also in other industrialized countries, the retail sector. So in the UK, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Morrisons, and Asda have a complete oligopoly of the retail market and bear a huge responsibility for labor and environmental abuses in their supply chains. So it kind of really grates on me when, they're being celebrated for feeding people under COVID-19 when they have, such historical responsibility of injustice, promoting injustice in the food chain. The other thing on this issue of creating poverty is that a kind of obsession with markets has turned countries in the developing world that were self-sufficient in food into net food importers through free trade agreements and investments, structural adjustment, debt, all the things that link us into other movements as well. The third thing, very quickly, is that the industrial food system creates what are so-called comorbidities, or the underlying health conditions that affect your survival rate if you do get COVID-19, malnutrition, non-communicable diseases, things like that. And it's one of the reasons that's been found in the US, and I'm sure it will be here as well, for why people from Black and ethnic minority groups are so at such higher risk, one of the reasons. So if you dig a little bit deeper, it's very clear that this system that doesn't have the answers to the shocks. But the problem is that the way that governments are addressing the crisis is making the situation worse now. So in several countries, example in India, where I'm from, there are really, really brutal lockdowns, which are closing down local markets, local vendors, where still the majority of people in the world go to buy their food, but also the majority of small-scale food producers go to sell. So in many parts of the world, you have huge mountains of crops that are rotting, but other parts which are starving. And then, of course, here in the UK and in many parts of Europe, you have a massive crisis of not having the migrant labor. And, you know, we have this kind of let's leave it to the market approach, even at this moment in many governments of how we deal with the crisis. And of course, a lot of these measures have had a very disproportionate impact on women because they produce most of the food and also operate in informal markets, mostly as women. The only other way, the only other thing that you will hear our governments, especially Western governments and institutions, international institutions, talk about to address the crisis is to minimize the impacts on the food supply or on global trade and food security. So that's it. All they talk about is keeping the global food trade running, when we know that it's one of the big problems. It has been one of the big problems in the past. So it can show us that, you know, there's going to be a huge resistance to any change. And just the last thing, which is really important, I think, is in many places, you know, while this is happening, peasants are being wiped out, working class are hungry. Many governments have taken advantage of the pandemic to consolidate their political power and cement authoritarian rule and go back on human rights. So emergency powers, no democratic oversight, so no parliaments running, full military control, surveillance, etc., which we should not be, it's basically intended to quell social unrest that will come with this crisis from the working class and rural peoples. So having said all that, I don't know how much time I have to talk about the good news, but there is good news, which is what I always say when I talk about food sovereignty and agroecology, is that we have the solutions on the ground. As many of you have said in the chat, who are farmers and people working actually in local communities, we have what we need on the ground to address the crisis and to feed people. It just needs policy support, public support to be scaled up and scaled out, essentially. And so while the industrial food system has tried to kind of advance its hegemony, it hasn't done that. So across the world, small-scale producers as peasants, fisherfolk, indigenous people, pastoralists still feed 70% of humanity. Even in Europe, where I am, 95% of farmers identify as family farmers. And they are still, there's a very small minority of food traded across international borders. So we still have these people who are living on the land, many of whom are managing ecosystems, managing the land, keeping the seeds, who are still fighting for the system that is their system of food sovereignty and peasant-controlled agriculture. So the fight is on. We haven't lost the battle. And the good thing about the COVID-19 crisis kind of given us glimpses of what that could look like. So, you know, mutual aid schemes, community kitchens, the huge influx of people into community-supported agriculture schemes, at least here in the UK and in many places in Europe, which is kind of incredible. It shows you where people turn to in times of crisis. So the food sovereignty movement, it has several principles, which gives us a way also for looking at how we get out of this crisis and what is a just recovery. And one is that you need to focus on providing people with food. So food is a human right, not a commodity. And this needs to be addressing both the denial of rights, for example, of workers to form unions, decent sanitation, decent housing, but also protecting rights. And there are several international instruments that we have won in the last few years, which look at the right of rural peoples, indigenous peoples, and food producers. The second thing is that you need to value your small-scale food producers. So put in place mechanisms for fair pricing, immediate measures to keep small producers in business and local markets and support local food systems, which would go a long way to feed people in this crisis, but also prevent more misery from poverty in small-scale producers. The third thing is to relocalize food systems. which you kind of try to roll back years of export-oriented agriculture, and also the kind of imposition as trade over everything else. So, for example, again in India, we have a system of public stocks of food, which distributes food but also procures food from farmers at set prices. And this has been a pillar of the response to COVID-19. But this system has been under a legal challenge in the World Trade Organization from the US and Canada for a number of years, as are attempts by developing countries to hold stocks in food, buffer stocks in food. So it's a completely crazy situation that we have. And the last thing I will say is possibly the most important at this point in time, is that the food sovereignty movement has prioritized what we call agroecological production systems for the recovery and an alternate system, which is kind of become it's a science of ecological agriculture, but it's also practices, biological integration, recycling, but it's also now a very strong political and social movement that has got a lot of evidence behind it on how it can hugely increase yields and be more fair and just, and a lot of international support as well. And this is what we would say that needs to be pursued. And I think the last thing to say is that whatever it is, we can call it, there are several different things that you can call the people's solutions that we talk about. Food sovereignty is a vision. There's also a vision for the Green New Deal. You could call it a vision for degrowth or buen vivir or whatever it is in your community. But I think we need to realize and get together that we are talking about the same thing. We mean creating kind of genuine, radical, and just democracies, which are centered around people and their participation in their rights. And we need to build our power to do that. And that's it.
Thanks so much, Kirtana. Every time you speak, I'm like, wow. Cool, thanks so much. So yeah, that was a kind of overview of the kind of international system, and yeah, these visions that we might be working towards at an international level and a local level, of course, as well. So now I'm going to pass over to Roz, who is the Scotland coordinator of the Landworkers Alliance, which is a UK-based union of farmers, growers, land-based workers, and they try and improve the livelihoods for their members, but also try and push for a change to the land and food system that we live in. And they're part of La Via Campesina, which is a really incredible international network of peasants and peasant organizations, which FOI works with a lot at an international level as well. So Roz, do you want to take it away?
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for that introduction. You've cut out what I have to say. And thanks for inviting me. It's really great to link up with the work that Friends of the Earth are doing on food sovereignty. So it's really great to be here this evening, and amazing to see everyone in the audience, and someone from Guatemala, and yeah, lots of people doing farming and really great food activism. So that's really hopeful to see how many people are out there and caring about this. So yeah, I'm the policy and campaigns coordinator for the Landworkers Alliance in Scotland, and we are a UK-based union of small-scale land workers, including farmers and forestry workers. We were established 7 years ago at an event in London that was looking at how to build a food sovereignty movement in the UK. And we really recognised at that point in time that there was not really a union that was speaking to the kind of farming and land system that we wanted to see in the UK. And so as a result of that, we set up the Landworkers Alliance as a union, and joined Via Campesina, which is, yeah, so amazing worldwide organisation, working and campaigning really hard on food sovereignty. It's got members in over 80 countries, and over 180 different organisations, all representing peasant farmers and small-scale producers in those countries. So, and the main work that we do, we do quite a bit of campaigning, mostly with Westminster, but more recently we've started doing some campaigning work with Scottish Government, but we also do a lot of support for our members, and some of that is with a vision and view to supporting the local food systems that Kirtana kind of talked about. So where there's more resilient supply chains, where there's lots of knowledge exchange going on around agroecology, and that's the two different elements of our work, kind of campaigning and knowledge exchange and training. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, from our perspective, in how the coronavirus has impacted on the food system in the UK specifically, and especially for our members, really echoing what Kirtana said before about this crisis really highlighting that our existing food system that we had before wasn't resilient, wasn't fair, wasn't just, and it's really shone a light on some of the existing problems that we have with this kind of dominance of supermarkets and corporate control of our food system, and we've seen those weaknesses come out really strongly, and also seen how governments are kind of still supporting a lot of that kind of corporate control, and that's disappointing at the moment, when you think this is a massive opportunity to start to make the changes that we really want to see. So in the UK, I guess when the lockdown happened, it was immediately concerning for a lot of people. 60% total food supply is from imports, so just considering the slowdown of movement of goods across borders because of increased checks and things like that, that did create kind of a really initial kind of panic in the system. A lot of people doing panic buying, a lot of wholesalers kind of seeing their shelves go empty immediately, and a lot of supermarkets with empty shelves. Amazingly though, like smaller grocery shops and suppliers kind of seem to manage a little bit better, and I think that does kind of show up this like dominance of supermarkets in how we shop. You know, people were going to the supermarkets to do all of these big shops, and the smaller shops were kind of like still able to manage with the regular supply of things. And then there was the major concern then about the fall in the labour workforce on farms in the UK. So there was an anticipated gap of 60 to 80,000 people in the workforce to do harvesting and land work, and that's because our agriculture system in the UK massively relies on migrant workers to do a lot of the farm work and harvesting. So there was kind of a big campaign around getting people to do that work, or to lift restrictions on migrants being able to travel. And now, concerningly, we do see private chartered flight companies chartering flights of migrant workers from Eastern Europe to Germany and the UK to come and fill that gap in the workforce. And we're campaigning along with a lot of the other European members of Via Campesina at the moment on the safety and health of the migrant workers that are being brought into the UK and Germany to do that work. And it's a very kind of complex situation to be in, where a lot of companies have had lots of applications from workers in the UK who are keen to work on farms, but then not always agreeing to take up that work because they might not have the kind of work standards that people would be expecting, and so they are then preferring to pay chartered flights to bring in workers that they probably can treat with less care than what a UK worker would stand for. So that's really concerning, and we're kind of working on that campaign a bit. Another thing that happened quite quickly is that a lot of the food banks that people rely on ran out of food really quickly as supermarkets stopped having waste. So much waste because people were buying stuff so quickly, and then obviously that having devastating impacts on people that have been relying on food banks. And I think now more than ever, this crisis just highlights how unsustainable and unfair the food bank system is in the UK, and how much we need to question how to set up alternatives to food banks and create longer term, more sustainable solutions to make sure that people are able to access food. And for us, that means people having money in their pockets so that they can buy the food that they want. And that gives them a choice of whether they're going to go to a supermarket rather than getting a supermarket voucher, and what kind of food they want to be getting. But that has been massive problem. And then we've seen for our members specifically, a lot of our members have very diverse business streams. So some will sell to a range of different customers, so restaurants, cafes, box schemes, have events, do training and courses and get income from that kind of thing. But very quickly, when the lockdown happened, a lot of our members suddenly had a complete loss of business from restaurants or events, and for some that has been really devastating, and they have had to very rapidly turn around their business models so that they're doing a lot more direct supply. So we've had some members that have gone from having quite mixed business of like 50 boxes and then supplying to a lot of different other businesses, to now doing over 150 boxes, and that's what they do. And they do the delivery of that. They deliver it to people who are self-isolating specifically, and that's amazing. And it was amazing to see how our members kind of turned around their business and really made those changes really quickly, and how resilient small scale farms can be in kind of adapting a lot of what they do. But that does come in the longer term potentially with some financial loss, because it is because of the loss of the diversity in income, and that some of the incomes that our farmers get are kind of more lucrative than running a box scheme, solely running a box scheme. Then in the longer term, we're looking at like some of our members kind of having some longer term financial difficulties, even though at the moment it seems like box schemes are really popular. There's been a massive upsurge in demand, and that's an amazing to see in terms of the popularity of the local food system. But we really need to think about the long-term sustainability of the pricing and the impacts that has on our business in terms of delivery runs and time off time off work in the field and stuff like that. So those are some of the things that we've been seeing. We have been lobbying the UK government really hard to try and get emergency business support for farmers, but also then with a longer term view for a more just transition to a more localized food system, and one that's based on food sovereignty and agroecology. We've been kind of working on this campaign about ensuring that all workers in the food system are valued, and working with a lot of food justice groups to really start to unpick and get the message right around food banks. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that that people can join in on. So we have a petition on our website, which is to Alok Sharma, calling for some of the things that I've highlighted already. And if you are interested, you can sign that petition. We also have on our website 6 ways that you can support farms during COVID-19. So that that includes like identifying farmers near you and kind of asking them what kind of support they need. It might be that if you have time, you can support them with some of the admin work or deliveries, or even just like showing that you support them and saying that you support the work that they do can be really valuable. Farming is really isolating work sometimes, and someone just telling you that you feel supported by them can mean quite a lot. We have set up a solidarity pot, which is for our members, so that they can apply to it for kind of emergency funds should they have staff or workers that are going off, that have been unable to work, and for other like emergency business support in terms of realigning their sales to online sales or things like that. So we are happy to take donations to the solidarity pot. And yeah, we also are working really hard. This has all come at a time when the UK Agriculture Bill and the Scottish Government Agriculture Bill are in the process of still being shaped, and also the Good Food Nation Bill in Scotland. And so we are continuing to campaign on that. And if you're interested in kind of learning a bit more about some of the campaign work that we do around that, you can sign up to our website or become a supporter member, and we can keep you posted. But, yeah, hope that's okay. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Roz. When I email out, you all signed up on Eventbrite, so I have your contact details. I'll email the links to all of those, the petition, the solidarity pot, etc., so that you can follow up with that.